Good evening and welcome to the Einstein Forum. For those of you who are watching us on Zoom, you will have an opportunity to ask questions after the talk. You can either do that through the Q&A function. You can also speak if you prefer, or you can write your questions there. It's a great pleasure to welcome Deborah Hertz. Deborah has been a professor of history at the University of California at San Diego for nearly 20 years, where she also co-founded and co-directs the Holocaust Living History workshop. I first became interested in her when she published Jewish High Society in Old Regime Berlin, many years ago, before I became a salonier myself. I should say that when I first came to the Einstein Forum, most of my colleagues were appalled when I referred to the Einstein Forum as a salon. That just means they didn't read Deborah's book, because certainly for a brief period of about a quarter of a century, the Berlin salons were the most intellectually exciting places in the city, probably in all of Germany. There was no university here, let's have it be remembered, but even more importantly, they were a place where people from different classes, aristocracy and commoners could mix, which was extremely unusual at the time, different genders, different religious groups. They were extraordinarily exciting and progressive places to be. And I highly recommend Deborah's book on the subject. It's been published in German, right? Oh, yeah, okay. For those of you who prefer to hear it there. She's also published a book, How Jews Became Germans, as well as a host of essays in Jewish history, German history, Jewish-German history, German-Jewish history, and always with a focus on women's stories. And tonight, if I understand properly, she's going to tell us more about the dark sides of this wonderful movement that I was so pleased to read about in her book. So thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Deborah's going to speak for about, what, 50, nearly an hour?
I can go really fast.
You don't have, don't go really fast, because first of all, some people will be listening whose native language is not English. So don't go too fast. Okay. And plus, we have some time. Deborah will speak. I'll probably ask her a few questions, and then you're all welcome to ask your own. So okay. Don't rush.
Thank you so much. Okay. So the question is with the slides. Should I move through the slides? But then can I move this machine? Oh, wonderful. Okay. That's great. Okay. So I'll just use this button. Okay. Wait, I need to start the slideshow. Do you know how to set? Oh, I see. This is my view. Okay. That's the next one. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. My university moved into a new building, and yeah, so we're always scrambling for space. Let me start by saying that it's great to be back in Berlin. I haven't lived here for a very long time. When I first started coming to Berlin, I was probably, you're probably too young to remember this, but I would come into Tempelhof. That was my first arrival in Berlin. Then I had many, many years of Tegel, and now I have this beautiful airport. I spent a lot of years in the 70s trying to craft a topic that would be my dissertation and then a book, and now it's actually still with me. I knew that I couldn't study the Holocaust. That was just not integrated into the German history narrative whatsoever in the 70s. And the Salon seemed to be a unique, a high-class event, which began with Jewish daughters rejecting the marriage plans of their fathers, which was a subject extremely dear to my heart at this time. And I used to walk up and down the Kudamm while I was studying at the Goethe Institute, and I used to have this dream. I would close my eyes and I would think of my book being in the bookshelf, you know, in the bookstore. And so it's wonderful to come back after all of these years. One of the aspects of working with a subject for a very long time as a historian, because both of my books were really concentrated on Berlin Jewry and the problematic of conversion, is it's like a very long marriage. Soon you know everything. There's nothing you don't know, and you have to decide, am I on board or do I know too much? In the beginning, I wanted to show the Germans their shining moment of toleration and of cross-religious love and friendship. I wanted to show the Jews, and this was very important to me, that we had once been personages of prestige and honor in Germany. So I saw myself working against all of the deterministic historiography that the Holocaust was inevitable. My book, I really intended it to be a discontinuity analysis. The problem, and that is what I'm talking about today, is that the deeper I went into the details, the more critical I became of their religious and social motives. And this is the dark side that taints their legacy, but is really, I think, an important dimension to understand the whole perspective. So I have up here a picture of Gershom Scholem, and it's Gershom Scholem who really pointed me to the dark side. Gershom Scholem wrote an essay in 1964 in a Festschrift for Margarete Sussman. It was called something like The Failed Symbiosis. Now, his idea of the failed symbiosis was all intellectual and cultural history. His idea was that Jews who contributed to German society left everything Jewish behind, whatever they had within them or whatever they had access to, and took on a German or a Christian. And of course, that distinction between German and Christian is a very important part of the story. And so it was never a symbiosis. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is I'm going to bring Scholem's analysis and critique of the failed symbiosis into the personal relationships. Because what I'm interested in when I write intellectual history is not just what was said and what were the ideologies and what were the theories, but what are the individuals who write those treatises? What are they thinking? Now, there's two questions that I want to pose for you that you can think about during the talk that I'm still not clear about. And sometimes the more you read, the less you understand. Had the conversions of the Salon women been authentically spiritual, or should we see them with a layer, a very thick layer? Opportunism is a kind of a nasty word. In my title, I used ambition, I used hypocrisy, something that's not quite religiously sincere. Another question that I'm still pondering, and my Israeli colleagues have done a lot to inform me on this topic, what about the Haskalah? The movement of reform in Judaism to make Judaism more modern, which of course is the inventor of the Haskalah, if you want, is Moses Mendelsohn, the father of one of the most controversial saloniers, Dorothea Mendelsohn. A third topic that I still worry about, and I'll come to this with a woman named Amalia Baer, how important was class and money in the decision about how to pursue assimilation? So there's some myths about the salons that my colleague Barbara Hahn has wonderfully illustrated in her work. Barbara Hahn goes to Krakow, and she has done a magnificent job of bringing the primary letters that are in the Krakow archive, which used to be Berlin, and it's a very long, twisted story of how they got to Krakow. She uses the letters to show a couple of things. The first is kind of a minor point. It's a nomenclature point, which is they don't use the word salon. And she's right, they don't. It's kind of a French label that was put on these social occasions. And I think she's right, but you'll see that I've completely defied her correctness because all through the talk I call them salons. So just a caveat that it's a quote salon. Her second a major finding, which is really does affect what I'm talking about here, is that rather than seeing women like Rahel Varnhagen, Dorothea, Mendelsohn, Weitschlegel as rebels who leave their families, and there is a lot of that, there was also a dimension of a family strategy to assimilate. In other words, that the parents sometimes came to the salons. A friend of mine was telling me yesterday, oh, when such and such a noble lady was met at the spa in Teplitz, you know, the mother back in Berlin wants to know what to serve for her. So the idea that this is women's history and not family history is a very important question. If you go back to the 1950s and you read the Leobeck Institute yearbook, which I read religiously for many years, I still do and publish in it, everything is about the symbiosis. If you see an article on Heine, if you see an article on Kafka, it's all about how they entered German culture and contributed to German culture. And there's nothing really in those articles about what was the Jewish suffering of making that assimilation. And so Sholem castigates this term of the Jewish symbiosis. Now I'm going to show you Mariana. Doesn't she look great? In my course on the history of nationalism, we have a lot of discussion of the female symbols. And if any of you have ever seen Mariana, she has one breast showing. She's kind of this Amazon woman. She has a rifle. She has a young boy on the side. She's leading, it was, I think, the 1832 revolution. Germania is a very different character, but I won't analyze her character, but I do want to point out that Philip Veit was the son of Dorothea Mendelssohn Weitschlegel, which makes him the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn. Who died in 1786. So the idea that his grandson is painting, you know, the grand Germanic Dama is, it would have been extremely upsetting to him. But this immediate, very fast transformation from Moses Mendelssohn to his grandson painting Germania is entirely, I would say, typical of this phenomena of a super speeded up assimilation, as my friend Stephen, the belated Stephen Lowenstein used to talk about it, which is very different from other patterns of assimilation. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to the major characters. I laughed so hard when I found this. Here's Rahel Varnhagen right in the middle, and don't give me the quiz because I need to do a little studying, but it's just a fabulous picture of, I don't know, there's Frederick the Great, there's Moses Mendelssohn sitting next to him. I love it when contemporary satirists and artists evoke. Certainly in a salon, they would not be sitting in that row, they would be together. So a little bit of a description of the dramatis personae of my talk. So first we have Rahel Levin. I call her Levin because she doesn't get married till 1814, and my tale today is really about 1813. So I get to leave off her last name. Her glory years as a charismatic salon host had ended when the French occupation of Berlin began in 1806. She wasn't poor. She had $8,000 a year, which $6,000 a year would have supported a professor and all his children and his family. So she's rich, but she doesn't feel rich because her life is both exalted and deprived in a complicated way. So at the time I'm going to be talking about her, she was still single in her early 40s. And now we'll move to her husband. No, we won't move to her husband. Sorry, I'm a little out of order here. Karl August Varnhagen von Ense. The von Ense is a kind of cheap shot nobility that he finds in an archive and somewhat illegally attaches it to his name. So they marry in 1814. He was a military journalist serving in the Austrian army during the Napoleonic Wars, then gets a position with a count, and he is a obsequious socialite. he loves to meet famous and important people and attach himself to them, which goes somewhat at odds with marrying a Jewish woman in 1814. And it's that frisson between his super ambitions and his philo-Semitism that is particularly interesting. He's forthright in his memoirs about his desire to meet and befriend those with high status. Okay, the next figure in our discussion here is, where did he go? Clement Sprentano, I lost him. There he goes. Okay. So Brentano, at the time this story takes place, was 33. He'd already written a very well-regarded novel. He was intimate with many of the romantic intellects, known as a childish prankster, a jaunty minstrel, and a devil-may-care satirist. He was the personification of many romantic values. Now, he's a guy who really didn't make it on his own, as we say. His parents wanted him to succeed in commerce and medicine and academia in the civil service. And as he worked through all of these careers, he ends up being supported by his family inheritance to be a gentleman writer. And it was in March of 1811 where he gave a very, very, very controversial speech at a club called the Christlich-Deutsche Tischgesellschaft. So in order to capture a few more people in the story, this is Rahel Varnhagen on the left and Henriette Herz on the right. No relation, alas. I would love to have been their descendant, but she had no children, so that wasn't really possible. And I have Achim von Arnheim. I'm sorry, a little out of order here. So on the left is Achim von Arnheim, who's the best friend of Clement Sprentano, and his wife Bettina, who is Clement's sister. So we have a very, I won't call them incestuous because it's not all sexual, but a group of people who have extremely complicated relationships to each other. So the Tischgesellschaft was considered to be a counter salon. In the rules, Jews were not allowed, and even converted Jews were not allowed, and even the descendants of converts were not allowed. So considering that Achim von Arnheim and Bettina and Clemens, they all have Jewish friends, everyone is aware that this is an attack, an escape on the dominance and the success of the salons. So in March of 1811, Clemens gives a talk, Der Philistiner vor in und nach der Geschichte. Who knows why he hated the Philistines? It's kind of a lost concept, the Philistines. But those in attendance found the speech wildly funny. Excerpts from the talk were reprinted in a newspaper. The Tischgesellschaft solicited subscriptions for those who wanted to purchase the printed lecture and read it. Now, the linkage of Jews and Philistines is not as clear as some people think it is, because I worked through the speech and tried to understand it. He doesn't really say explicitly anti-Semitic things, but there is this undercurrent that Jews are Philistines and we don't like Philistines. Therefore, to not, okay, internet audience is, your internet connection is unstable. I'm sure you've seen that many times. Clemens' basic position is that Philistines could never be spiritual. And if they couldn't be spiritual, they couldn't be religious. That means they couldn't be Christian. Now, does that mean they couldn't be German? There's a lot of links here to be explored. So Achim von Arnheim and Clemens had been discussing this issue for years. Achim von Arnheim had a novel and a play on the topic written in the period. Now, Bettina was under a lot of stress in this time period because in the same month, it's like this month when everything happens. So he gives the speech and Achim von Arnheim gets married to Clemens' sister, but they don't tell Clemens that they're getting married because he had a reputation as unpredictable and volatile. So then Clemens explodes because he's been excluded from the wedding. Now, those who have followed Bettina von Arnheim would find her, quote, anti-Semitism, I'll say that in quotes, a little bit complicated. When she was a young girl in this large Catholic family in Frankfurt, she'd befriended an impoverished Jewish girl. Her parents were appalled by that. Now she's, the point we entered the story, she's 26, and she's very insulting to Rahel. And the point that I'm going to make in this talk is Rahel Levin kind of looks the other way and takes the attacks. Later in the 1830s, they develop a close relationship, and overall, she's gone down in history as a philo-Semite. So what I'm talking about is sort of a buried part. The place that we're entering in 1811 is Prague. Everyone was fleeing to Prague. Clemens was fleeing to Prague. He was actually sent there to help administer his estate. But Achim von Arnheim, Bettina, Rahel, they are all going to Prague because they're escaping the war that's raging or beginning to rage in Berlin. So this was a magnet destination, and the three protagonists are put in a situation that they would not have been in. They would not have been in this situation in Berlin. They're kind of thrown together in Prague where they become friendly, and in these friendships develop these antagonistics. The history goes back to the University of Halle, where Varnhagen von Ense and Clemens had become friends, and Clemens had a distant relationship with Rahel when he was in Berlin. They have a lot of people in common, but he's not a habitué of her salon. So let me talk about the first episode. They were having a warm conversation when suddenly Bettina attacks her as a Jew to her face. When she writes in her diary, Rahel says she spoke out in defense of herself, and Bettina walked off in a huff. But a few minutes later, she returns, took Rahel's arm, and they begin chattering in an intimate way. Later, 2 months later, Rahel writes a letter to August, who's not in Prague, that Bettina had also insulted her behind her back to Henrietta Schleiermacher, Friedrich's wife. And there is Schleiermacher, the dominant liberal romantic philo-Semite in the story. Less than a year later, Clemens quoted Bettina having said to him that Rahel was a garstige, zudringliche Juden. And at the same time, we can track Rahel's letters where she's writing to everyone how much she adores Bettina and she adores Clemens because they're romantic personalities and they don't go by the Prussian hierarchy and they're altogether liberated and they're wonderful people. So you can see how she's both bragging and somehow trying to defend herself. Now, Varnhagen plays an amazing role. Sometimes he tries to protect Rahel Levin from the hostility, but most of the time in these episodes, he deliberately exposes her to this hostility. Now, we can talk in a few minutes about why he does this. So it's important to remember that all of them know about the Tischgesellschaft speech. So there's no secrets here. You don't need the internet and email and Instagram. They had their ways of communicating. So everybody knows that the Tischgesellschaft is an attack on the Jewish salons. And the question is, how do they respond to that? Now, keep in mind that not everyone in the Tischgesellschaft would be considered anti-Semitic. Schleiermacher was a member. Ernst Moritz Arendt, our next figure that I'll talk about in the second part, was in Berlin. He was not actually a member, but he and Arnheim together were in another club called the Gesetzlosgesellschaft, lots of fun in that group. And they were all very involved in the Grimm project. So collecting oral histories of folklore, some of which was, of course, originally French and not really German, was an important part of the nationalist project. And another key player here, I think he's next. Oh, nice. I finally see how this is organized, was Fichte. Fichte, you know, the strong atheist intellect of the nationalist movement, and his talks in 1807, Rahel attended them. She doesn't seem to know that he wrote in other places, the only way to emancipate the Jews is to cut all their heads off. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that intellectual historians have a kind of crude listing of how things are moving, and real people in real time are knowing different things at different times. So whether Rahel Varnhagen knew about this comment about cutting their heads off, I'm not entirely clear. Clemens was constantly talking about the celebrity Jewish women. They were writing nasty things. And then so Bettina writes a letter to Clemens. Varnhagen gets a hold of the letter, and then Varnhagen sends the letter to Rahel. That's a moment at which this so-called ideal marriage begins to look a little bit nutty to my perspective. Why is he doing that? Well, one explanation is he's doing that to show Rahel that he's covering her back. And he knows everything that's being said about her that's nasty, and he's going to actually share it with her so she can know the truth. But it was obviously quite a malicious triangle. Now, if we look at what Rahel Levin has written about nationalism exactly in this time period, she definitely sees herself a nationalist. She was enthusiastic about the French Revolution, but after 1806, she's committed to the Prussian struggle. But she is aware of the irony of this. She writes in 1808 to Varnhagen how easy and natural it is to love one's fatherland if only it loves you back just a little. I mean, that's a quote that could serve you, you know, all the way to 1930s and 1940s. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a woman who is very rich, very committed to Judaism. But as you see here, she's entirely emancipated in her dress, right? She's got a cleavage there. She's not wearing any sort of a cap. And her name was Amalia Bear. And Amalia Bear takes a very, very, very different road. She's not famous. I don't know why she's not famous, but she's really quite fascinating. They organized the first Reform temple in Berlin in 1815, which has something like 400 people coming to it. And what I find extremely fascinating is here are two routes out of traditional Judaism. Amalia Bear's route, she's the mother of Giacomo Meyerbeer. She has 4 Wunderkinder. She's extremely rich. She and her husband have dinner once a week with Count von Hardenberg and discuss the terms of the 1812 emancipation. So she's someone who uses her assimilation to, as it were, negotiate and bargain with the real powers, and then also appears utterly unhypocritical by her devotion to Reform Judaism. So the question I'm fascinated by, and all my characters, I always want to call them up on the phone and say, you know, there's a couple things I just want to clear up here, you know, and let's talk for a few hours. I'll push play on the tape recorder and we can get to the bottom of some of these issues. But the historians, of course, were just, you know, we're just going through these papers looking for hints and clues. But I do want to point out one of the downsides of the Meyerbeer strategy. So the Meyerbeers contribute a great deal to the Prussian cause, to the military cause, to the diplomatic causes. And when Prussia is in a terribly difficult situation between 1807 and 1813. And the problem with their perspective is, on the one hand, they're developing Reform Judaism to show the government that they deserve emancipation. So you give us equal rights and we'll show you they're not really traditional Jews. It's not exactly self-hatred, but it's a very fine-tuned negotiation. Also, the money that they're giving into the government is then used by people who oppose emancipation to say, well, you just bought it anyway. So, you know, if you rich Jews buy emancipation, it's not really serious and we can take it back. So there's a dark legacy to what they're doing. So let's now move a little bit into the January of 1812, when Varnhagen is complaining to Rahel. So now Varnhagen is moved to a different position. His new position is that he's going to show Rahel that Clemens is a terrible anti-Semite. So he has, he has the most disgusting prejudices. Meanwhile, Clemens is writing these letters complaining about her immoral friends and her lack of tact. Now, the immoral friends is a very interesting accusation. It has to do with a woman named Paulina Wiesel, who was beautiful and wealthy and totally sexually emancipated. So here we see this idea. I've been at a conference for 2 days at the TU on anti-Semitism and sexuality. And the perspective in that conference is that anti-Semitism is always gendered. It's very hip, but this is a perfect example of it. So we don't just not like you because you're ambitious, because you're desperate to succeed. We don't like you because your friends are sleeping around. It's exactly what was talked about in the conference. So then Rahel explodes at Varnhagen and says, "Why are you sending me these letters?" Then he feels very guilty, right? He loves this woman. He wants to marry her. He wants her to be admired by everyone. So now what he does next is really amazing. And you have to wish these people had a Xerox machine. So Clemens is working on a play, Alois and Imelda, and in order to take revenge for these nasty letters that he himself has sent to his lover, Varnhagen steals the manuscript, the only manuscript. You know, for a writer, this is a complete disaster. And it goes on, everybody knows about it. And finally, Rahel convinces Varnhagen, or Levin convinces Varnhagen that he should give it back, okay? So you can see these are very complicated people. And Clemens, you know, he's very sensitive as well as being insulting to Rahel Levin. And eventually he describes this as the most dreadful experience of my whole life. But he does get his play back. Then, of course, there's a problem because one of the characters in the play is actually based on Varnhagen, and it's very negative. So whatever happens in these relationships, you always seem to descend into trouble. What happens next? In the first week of July, Rahel, they're in Prague and they're corresponding, they're meeting together almost daily. He's very terrified that he's going to insult her again. And they seem to be happy. But then he reads passages of the play, which get her inflamed. Finally, she writes him a letter, the last letter that she ever wrote to him, August of 1813. She expresses his anger and she broke off the friendship. Now, he doesn't like that. He feels very upset because he's been trying to be nice. I don't know, this sounds like a teenage high school drama, right? But eventually she doesn't respond and he feels hurt, and that's the end of the relationship. Now, the two of them go in very interesting ways religiously after this event. Rahel converts and marries Varnhagen. Perhaps her painful exchanges with Clemens deepened her conviction that her future as a single Jewish woman was going to be difficult if she didn't marry him. And I mean, I think she loved him. I think she wanted to get married to him, but it's entirely convincing that she would feel even more urgent about escaping this whole problematic by marrying him. Clemens is passionately dedicated to the Catholic faith, and he spends 6 years caring for an ill nun. And so they never really meet up again. They both are ending up as Christians. Now, 8 years after this all happened, you have the Hep Hep riots. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this before, and I don't know that I can use, oh, I can. Okay, I want to focus on this couple right here, because all the other characters in this image, which we have to take as some true representation of what happened, because I don't have another one, you know, would kind of fit the bill of an artisan woman, and this person looks a little bit modest in their clothing, but this person is not someone we expect to see in a pogrom. If you looked at 1881 pogroms in Russia, you never see someone like that. At least they would have taken that clothing off before they headed off to hit the Jews. And over here, we also see a very, very disturbing image of a round and pudgy, very Jewish looking man who's clearly trying to dress in an assimilated way. And here, of course, you see the water, or maybe it's even urine, I don't know, being poured on the heads of someone. But this representation inside of this image is exactly the human interaction that I'm talking about in this talk, that a gentleman in fine clothing would attack someone who's being mocked for also trying to be in fine clothing fits Arnheim exactly. And if you go into the details of an episode that happened that I cut out of this talk, but I'd happy to be talk about, is that Achim von Arnheim shows up at a salon also in 1811, in June of 1811, at the home of Sarah Levy. And when he comes, he's not been invited. His wife has been invited, but not him. But he comes anyway, and he starts insulting the Jews around him in this home of Sarah Levy. Interestingly enough, the home where he had his engagement party with Bettina just a year before, and the nephew of Sarah Levy, the host, challenges him to a duel, but he can't be in a duel. You can't, a Jew is not duel-fähig. They're not admitted to the magic circle of people who can revenge an insult. They're supposed to just receive the insult. And it ends up in court, and ultimately Moritz is not only exonerated by the court, but serves in the War of Liberation and dies. Whereas Achim von Arnheim escapes fighting as a soldier, sits back in his estate writing poetry. And there was a lot of mockery at the time, you know, that the Jewish victim is the patriot who gives his life for Prussia, you know, and the nobleman does not. And Rahel writes a comment to her brother in August of 19, when the pogroms were raging, about the role of intellectuals in inciting the pogrom. She wrote him that for 3 years I have been saying that the Jews will be assailed. The insinuation that for years have been making their way through all the papers, Professors Fries and Roos and whatever they are called, Arnheim and Brentano, and other high-ranking prejudiced persons were responsible for the violence. So I'm going to conclude this section now. Who was the real Rahel Varnhagen? The woman who spent 2 years pursuing a friendship with a man who had publicly humiliated Jews and privately insulted her, or the woman who blamed the same man for insulting, for helping cause the riots? We can sympathize her. We have to sympathize with her. And I want to read for you a comment by the Israeli historian Walter Grab, who made a comment in a conference. It's kind of a buried quote. It's very hard to find, but it was a conference in Germany in '82. And Grab says that one of the speakers at the conference had neglected the anti-Jewish rules of the Tischgesellschaft. And then he said it was unexplainable how Rahel could, with this disgusting anti-Semite, you know, be friend. I got my, when I read a German sentence, I have to move part of it forward, how she could have been friends with this disgusting anti-Semite. Now, I'd like to also have a little chat with Walter Grab. Did he mean that she should never have befriended Brentano in the summer of 1811? Or did she mean she should have cut off contact earlier? I'd love to have that conversation. Now, what was her inner identity in 1813? In order to understand how an insult feels to someone, you have to know how they see themselves. So Hannah Arendt claimed, I don't know if you get wrapped up in the Hannah Arendt analysis of everything on the planet, but she claimed that Rahel was a conscious pariah, meaning a rebellious outsider. I totally disagree with that. I think she was a conscious pariah, a parvenu. In the Arendt world, there's either pariahs or parvenus. So you're either excluded or you're a social climber. And I think she got this one really, really wrong. For instance, Rahel at one point writes to her brother, "People like us cannot be Jews." And writes to her brother also, "The Jew must be extirpated from us." So one way to look at this whole story is that she considers herself post-Jewish. So she doesn't have to defend her Jewishness because she isn't Jewish anymore. Well, that's a bit of a stretch. in spite of her willingness to befriend Brentano, we might consider that she puts his nasty, let's call it anti-Semitism, although I'm not sure that's the best word for it, into the larger picture of who he is as a person, that they shared this outsider status. But it still seems difficult not to agree with Walter Grab that there's something disturbing about her willingness to put up with his nasty comments. And this is where the part in my lecture about ambition fits in. We might conclude that his status made him an attractive friend, and because she was fond of him, she was willing to suffer some degree of emotional abuse until it became too toxic, and then she cut it off. Now, it would be nice to think that Rahel Varnhagen could have been Amalia Behr, because then we would have avoided this extreme conflict between the obsequious, ambitious Jew and the hostile friends, and we would have had a different pathway. But I don't think that's entirely possible. I think part of it is personality, part of it is class. I think her $800 did not, and the lack of a secure Jewish husband did not give her the, shall we say, inner confidence to create a new form of Judaism. Okay, now I'm going to go to our next two protagonists, Henriette Herz and Ernst Moritz Arendt. That's not Henriette Herz. This is a woman named Charlotte. We'll see her in a minute. So Arendt has a very interesting story. And the point of this story is very similar to Fichte, is early German nationalism is a class mixing movement. One of its great virtues is you could start out poor, but if you're smart and you're committed, you can rise to really a quite considerable position. So Arendt is born on the island of Rügen. Is anyone from there? I've never been there, but it's a very important part of this story. He receives his PhD from Greifswald, where he later taught history. And little sidebar, the University of Greifswald had a big campaign to rename the university. I don't know if anyone's followed that or if it's very successful, but has it been successful, or is it still called, they renamed it? You're going to check. Okay. Thank God for the phones, or we would know nothing, right? So in the years leading up to the War of Liberation in 1813, he's a high-level policy official. He's publishing influential books, pamphlets, poetry, and songs. Metternich, after 1815, despises him, considers him a dangerous radical. So we can kind of put him as a left-wing patriot. His vision would be that a future German nation state would unify the scattered folk. Duh. 1870, Bismarck, he seems pretty prophetic on this one. But unlike our other protagonists, whose hostility to Jews is somewhat coded because they're intellectuals, he's a policymaker. And in all his writings, he was emphatic that Jews could never belong to the German people. Sometimes he said that if you were from Germany, the German lands, you could belong to the German people, but no Eastern Jews could be allowed to move into any Germanic territories. Well, that's a problem, right? Because there are floods and floods of Polish and of Jews who are coming into Germanic territories. Now, Ernst Moritz Arendt and Henriette Herz, they had many friends in common. One was Schleiermacher. One was Nana, who's Schleiermacher's half-sister, a friend of Henriette Herz's, and became Moritz's second wife, Ernst Arendt's second wife. Another way they were linked is through this woman whose name was Charlotte von Courland, who's a close friend of Arendt and a patron for Henriette Herz. In 1808, when she was an impoverished widow, Von Courland was the rare Christian noblewoman willing to employ Hertz as a governess, although she was still Jewish. Now, this is a very, very important point, because it's one thing to spend an hour a week at a salon. It's another thing to invite a Jewish woman into your house to educate your children. So in 1819, when Ernst Moritz Arndt and his wife Nana invite Henrietta to be their house guest at their new home in Bonn, where he had just gotten a professorship. At the time, I don't know how much they're talking or thinking about Jewish issues because Henrietta was altogether shocked when the police show up for a house search on the lookout for books hostile to the Metternich regime. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on when she goes to this visit, to a house visit for several days. Was she blind to what he had written? She might have been aware of his views, but had been careful not to discuss the topics with him in mixed social settings. So that's one idea. You've internalized what this person has said. You've decided that you're going to pursue a relationship of some kind with them, and you're not going to talk about it. You might say there's a certain sanity in that view. Maybe both of them wanted to avoid this topic. Now, was there more self-hatred in her behavior that has been seen, or more tolerance on his side? Those are the questions. So let's talk a little bit about her Jewish identity. This is a very famous painting, and I'll talk about one of the odd elements of her hair and her cleavage regarding Jewish, let's say the rabbinical monitoring of Jewish women's bodies, which has always been very important. So she knew all the antinomies that we're talking about: Enlightenment versus Romanticism, Universalism versus Nationalism, Judaism versus Christianity. These were all conflicts that she experienced from the inside. Now, she converts in 1817. And when she converts, this is extremely interesting. She goes to a small town where she's converted by a pastor who's actually a friend of her sister's who lives in that town. Now, there was a lot of intense conversation about conversion in this time period. One way to look at it is conversion is the legit loophole between the religions. And if you suffer as a Jew from ethnic hostility, you have a religious opportunity to cease being Jewish, which perhaps would you would let go of your of the ethnic prejudice against you. And what I find interesting about this is that her conversion, Rahel Levin's conversion, they're anticipating, they're the celebrity high-end beginning of a trend that only gets bigger and wider and more popular for the centuries to come. You know, by the time the Nazis come to power, there's 500,000 partial Jews who are unaffiliated, in addition to 565,000 who are members of the Jüdische Gemeinde, some of whom are also partial Jews, but most of whom are full Jews. So you've got basically two huge camps, and this camp of the 500,000 non-Jewish Jews or post-Jewish Jews, you know, of course, as you know, are labeled as Jewish. What happens on the inside when you've grown up thinking that you're a Lutheran and then all of a sudden you're told that you're Jewish? So it's quite extraordinary that Henriette Herz is also not going the path of Amalia Bear. She's not identifying as a modern Jew. Let me talk about her hair for a minute. It's not perhaps pertinent to the conversion, but it is pertinent to how the women were negotiating with their husbands and with the rabbis to have quite a bit of freedom here. Now, on the eve of her wedding, this would have been some time before her wedding, her parents commissioned this painting by Dorothea Theerbusch, and the picture was hung on the wall of the young couple. It's a sensual image. Her shoulders are bare. Her hair is flowing down. She has flowers in her hair and quite a bit of cleavage. Okay, so this suggests, as the picture of Amalia Bear did, that the parents and the husbands are perfectly willing to have their daughters and their wives sexualized in a very, very modern way. But then once she's safely married, the flowing locks displayed in the painting had to vanish from public view because a Jewish woman cannot, the rabbis will not allow her to walk down the street dressed like this. So there's a huge fight about the cap. I don't have an image here of the cap, but you know, it was, if you go to Israel or you see religious Jewish women, their hair is covered. It had evolved, if you look at pictures of Gluckel of Hameln, into a very beautiful pearled cap that you would wear, and your hair would be under it. But Henriette Herz and her friend Rahel and Dorothea, they're not going to accept the cap, because if they're wearing the cap, they can't have, you know, Alexander von Humboldt, you know, sitting around in their dining room because they're too marked as Jewish. So they get permission actually to get rid of the cap. And we don't have any pictures of any of them with the cap, but they're also not allowed to be like this. But there's some kind of performative impulse that the parents have to have her look like this in a painting, but not in reality. So it's obviously incredibly complicated with women's bodies being the, I don't know, you would say the landscape or the portrait here. Now, when she was married, and she married at a very young age to a doctor named Marcus Hertz. My father was Marcus Hertz, but the mail never comes from him, directed to him. She was in outrage with her parents because after 14, she was not allowed to go to school, but she sits alone in her room. She masters 5 languages. She published 2 translations of travel books. Alas, she wrote 2 novels, but her friend Dorothea criticized them and she burns them. You know, so much of the great material just, you know, went into the fireplace in this time period. So she's in a secret club, a very interesting secret club in 1787. And this is, so that would have been before her marriage. It's funny, when I'm in Berlin, everything that for you is just a street, you know, for me is like a person, a legacy, a heritage. So this is Wilhelm von Humboldt. And I know that his brother Alexander is probably more famous, but in this particular story, it's Alexander that we're concerned with. So he's in a club with them, Brenna and Dorothea Mendelsohn in it, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and his wife, Carolina. He learns Hebrew from Henriette Herz in this club. But after time passed, he really sends her under the bus. He sees less of her. When he works on emancipation in the 1812 emancipation decree, he makes a comment where he says to his wife, "I'm so glad we've emancipated the Jews because now I don't have to invite them over anymore." So the idea, you can either have a token Jewish friend, or you can have progress for Jewish rights, but you certainly don't have to do both. Your guilt has been already dismissed once you work on the emancipation. Henriette Herz's closest friend is Friedrich Schleiermacher, and he discusses everything with her, all the plans, and he's fully aware of, for instance, her assistance to Dorothea Mendelsohn, who is an authentic rebel, whose parents or her mother, the mother is alive, the father is dead, do not want her to leave her husband Veit and run off with Schlegel. And she does suffer really tremendously for that decision. Dorothea, she changes her name from Brendel to Dorothea. When I first wrote my dissertation, I had someone typing it and she kept changing Brendel into Brenda. And I kept saying her, this is one, it's not Brenda. And everyone in this particular situation would be involved in discussing what a Jewish woman should do. So Schleiermacher and Henriette Herz are discussing when should Dorothea leave and should she really marry Schlegel. It ends up very, very badly for Dorothea because Schlegel does not turn out to be a very, what do we call that kind of husband? What my mother calls husband material in terms of supporting her. And they have she has a complex negotiation with the father of her 2 children, the Weitz, and that was the Germania picture that I showed you earlier. So we see two different roads that are going on here in the fight for German emancipation from the Napoleonic yoke. One is just pure patriotic. The other one is patriotic plus a kind of Jacobin dedication to social justice. And Varnhagen is definitely on that side. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Schleiermacher, and this is actually, yeah, there's Dorothea. It's hard to find a wonderful picture of her when she's younger. The picture that you find all over the internet is a really dreadful picture of when she's much older. This is actually my final slide. It's the Humboldt University in 1811. So they're working very closely together, Schleiermacher, Fichte, Humboldt, on the pedagogy for the university. And they see it in a very socially progressive way, a socially diverse student body and faculty, a very strong emphasis on research, and Schleiermacher is a tremendously important person. Now, to get back to the story of Henrietta, so Schleiermacher and his half-sister, who's married to Arendt, are all involved in Henriette Herz's life. She works there as a governess, and now I want to focus on a key moment. There's a key moment in this story. I don't obviously have a picture of it, is that Henriette Herz, a widow, a convert, and even before she was converted, celebrated Christmas with the Schleiermachers every year and called them her second family. When she begins these celebrations, she's known to be Jewish before she converts and is known by everyone else to be Jewish. So I want to stop for a minute and contemplate what this means. It's a very prestigious situation to have a standing invitation for Christmas, but there might have been some secret pain at such a dramatic switch. These are women who grew up in the 1870s and the 1880s, and already 15 years later, they're celebrating Christmas with a prominent preacher. I find it a very rapid, it's not just a social assimilation, it's also a religious assimilation. It's remarkable that by 1809, Henriette Herz possessed the intellectual and social pedigree to feel comfortable at these Christmas celebrations. But however deeply she integrated in elite Christian society, I would have to surmise there was a gap between her religion of birth and her inner sense of self and her new identity as a Christian. So why did she do this? Her husband was committed to the reform of Judaism and had a close relationship with Dorothea's father, Moses Mendelsohn. She was loyal to her mother, but she was not loyal to Judaism. And here I mentioned the project called the Dry Baptism. The Dry Baptism was proposed by David Friedlander from Königsberg, who was a leader in the Jewish community, and he proposes that the Lutheran elite, religious elite, give permission for Jews to convert without declaring that they really believe in Jesus. It's kind of like becoming Unitarians in 1815. Well, it didn't go anywhere. There was no way that the Lutheran pastors were going to agree to this, but the idea that a leader in the Jewish community proposes it publicly in a 1799 letter is astonishing. And I looked and discussed this with many scholars in the field. Does he get reaccepted into the Jewish community? Yes, absolutely. So it shows that this impulse to convert and the agony over the terms of the conversion were publicly understood by everyone. And Friedlander himself is kind of like Amalia Baer. He doesn't actually convert. I don't know if I can keep talking and project.
Sorry, I should give you some water.
It's okay. It's okay. Well, we need to think of our audience out in the wider world here. From inside the Jewish world, had it succeeded, a dry baptism would have trumped the fragile baby steps of the early Haskalah. It was serious indeed. Thank you, Susan. If the most reform-minded Jews were thinking that conversion was the only strategy that would work. I'm going to move to a conclusion here, rapidly moving through. So let's look a little bit at Henrietta Hertz's plight overall as she's celebrating Christmas with the Schleiermachers, and as she's scrambling for an income because she was actually quite poor at this time. We gaze with sympathy at her plight, demoted overnight from a prominent intellectual hostess star to loneliness and comparative poverty. Any woman forced to live without the protection of marriage in her day would find life challenging. We already saw that with Rahel Varnhagen, especially after enjoying a quarter of a century of the high society life. She's proud of herself. She earns an income in very interesting ways. She teaches German to domestic servants. She provides a lunch table for local students and operates a lace making workshop. She gets a couple of offers of marriage that she actually turns down. We don't know the love relationship to that. So when she gets the governess position in Rügen, she's very pleased with this, because there's no doubt that it was very difficult for most prominent Christian Germans to hire her. The Jewish status was really a barrier. So she gets that governess position. And one of the ironies of this situation is that Charlotte von Rügen wants to learn how to be a salonier from Henriette Herz. So she has a kind of social cultural capital that does help her. Let's turn now from biography to analysis to sum up why Henriette Herz chose conversion and looking at practical, spiritual, national, and social motives. I stress national because I've come to think over the years that nationalism can be a civic religion, and that the division between theological and political is not terribly useful in this situation. And for all conversions, when you go into the detail, like any other monumental landmark decision in a person's life, it's layers of decisions. It's not one motive. It's usually many motives. We can rule out that she was seeking pragmatic gain. She's not about to get married. So unlike Rahel, there's nothing pragmatic drawing her to conversion because she turns down these two offers. A second possible motive would be authentic religious conversion. So here the death of the mother is crucial. If we believe that she was moving towards Christianity on the inside, but she didn't want to hurt her mother, then she waits till her mother dies and at that point becomes a Protestant. I have this uncle in St. Paul who was in my childhood was much beloved, and nobody knew why he wasn't married, but he had this friend, and the friend wasn't Jewish. And then at a certain point, the mother dies and he suddenly has a wife. So this kind of obeisance to parents went on through the generations. Now, some observers from today think that she was sincere, but there's really no way to tell. If you burn your novels and you don't write diaries, and besides, are you going to write something like, I don't really believe in Christianity, I think I'll just do this? No, that's not what you're going to write. So this is where I want to move into the part of my title that has to do with German nationalism. Like many of her contemporaries, Henriette Herz seems, from what we have, to have viewed Judaism as a harsh religion of rituals and laws, in contrast to Protestantism as a religion of emotion. So we can certainly see here how romantic attitudes towards life and love would have enhanced the allure of Christianity. So here I'm really talking about the entanglement of Romanticism and German nationalism. Protestant songs and rituals were part of national celebrations. We might call this an existential stance towards Judaism and Christianity, in which Judaism cannot be entangled with Romanticism or with nationalism, but Lutheran Christianity could be. And because of her friendship circle, she would not have needed lectures or pamphlets or books to believe that being a good German meant You needed to be a Protestant. So one way to look at this all is she just wants to get rid of the symbolic ghetto of Jewish names, habits, languages, and relationships. Another cluster of motives is to look at her baptism as an act of covering. Now, I get this notion of covering from a Japanese legal scholar at NYU called Kenzie Yoshino, who's written a very interesting book about gay assimilation, in which his argument is that you can do an act of covering in which you act as if you belong to the dominant society while intact, you have a completely intact view of who you are, but you know that it will be a little bit easier for everyone if you don't sort of put it in their faces. I always used to think that, you know, Obama's short haircut was an act of covering. It's not hypocrisy. It's not self-hatred. It's a kind of a pragmatic external assimilation. And I think that would be a good sort of less judgmental explanation of a lot of these conversions. So here we're not going to explain all of, you know, which is the right motive. I want to turn a little bit to Ernst, who's kind of a mystery bogeyman in this analysis, unlike Clement Sprentano, who's so much more realized as a personality. Now, he may have agreed to the invitation of 1819 as a favor for Schleiermacher, who was his brother-in-law. That might have been one of the problems. Now, maybe he didn't see Henriette Herz as Jewish. She was a well-known intellectual and socialite, which is also extremely interesting because there is a strand of extreme misogyny in German nationalism, where Fichte and other German nationalists say that the role of the good German wife is to support the movement and support her husband and not have her own salon. For instance, Arendt opposed women speaking French, wearing French fashions, or reading French literature. Now, here's a perfect example of how that binary French-German is visited on women. So the salon is French. You know, being an intellectual is French, having emancipated sexual relationships, that's all French. So if you're going to be a good Prussian or a good German, you can't do any of those things. So Henriette Herz, who's not a mother, represents exactly the values and practices that he reviled as a public intellectual in the inner circle of romantic writers. So the question is, why does Arendt, and this is a huge question, which I can't really answer here, but just to hint at some of the main points. Why did he include this passage that Jews couldn't be part of the German folk? Because if you can't be part of the German folk, you can't be part of the nationalist movement that's fighting to create the conditions for the folk. So this requires to take us into the problematic of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which is something that is much discussed in the world that I live in. Before this era, hatred of Jews was mainly religious, and it was not connected to the issue of how to unite the German people. But it becomes very political, of course, because of the French revolutionary government, which gives rights to Jews in 1791, and Napoleon is explicit about bringing a kind of Jewish emancipation to all the places that are conquered. You know, when you read Heine, you get this amazing sense of the joy that he took as Napoleon is conquering Germany and, you know, bringing emancipation. And then you can sort of see the other people standing by and say, well, not only did we hate you, Napoleon, for all these reasons, but now we also hate you for these reasons. And emancipation became an unwanted gift bestowed upon the local populations. And after the Napoleonic Wars are over, the emancipation is retracted in most of the places, not in Prussia, but in many other places. Then too, we see activists created feelings of inner solidarity by excluding others. The tendency to define the in-group by attacking the out-group was all the more powerful because there are no firm boundaries around Germany. So if there are no firm boundaries, you can't just say, oh, you can't come across this border. You have to say you're not in the folk, because the folk is not yet a state. So you could say that this desire to have outsiders in order to create insiders is extremely powerful. The new political hatred of Jews could channel centuries of myths, stereotypes, and theological disputes and sheer public hatred. You know, this is something that we're quite aware of as historians. We have a great deal of difficulty actually articulating it, that you can have a stratum of religious hatred, then you can have a stratum of political ideology, and the two can, the top layer can feed from the second layer from the bottom layer without it always being explicit. Now, he was clearly inconsistent because he allowed that local Jews could assimilate by converting, but Eastern European Jews had to be kept out. Perhaps that's in his mind because the Jews in the Germanic lands had made this huge progress. Whoa, I should stop talking here. This is going on too long. Let me move to my conclusion. I'm sorry. When you're reading something like this, you're living it so powerfully that you just don't look at the clock. So in closing, the willingness of both Rahel Varnhagen and Henriette Herz to socialize with prominent intellectuals who are obviously hostile to Jews raises the question of inner costs of assimilation. Although in my title, I invoke the notion of hypocrisy, in the final analysis, I'm not so sure that's an apt term. After all, neither woman was committed to Judaism by the era of the Napoleonic Wars, so they weren't exactly burying some inner Jewish identity. They had perhaps already buried that Jewish identity before. For historians of Judaism, however, how such an inner sense of Jewishness could disappear so fast remains a troubling issue. And I think in closing, the idea that the Salon women are still important in the way that Susan's introduction suggested, and I certainly believe this over the long years that I worked on those two books, it's an important legacy for all religious and ethnic minorities who understandably seek success and recognition in the wider society without losing their souls and the inner resources necessary for productivity and happiness. Okay, thank you. Now, Susan, if there are going to be questions, I'm going to need a piece of paper. I know, I could write it
pieces of paper.
Small piece.
You know, we'll do one question at a time. Oh, Martin's getting something.
Okay.
We'll do one question at a time.
Okay.
How's that?
Okay.
Because I find it, confusing to do more than one. That was a wonderful lecture. I totally understand why you wish you could call them up and ask to clarify things. I was also struck towards the end of your lecture by thinking, you know, how much has changed. I don't know if you know this, but about half of the rabbis in this country are converts.
In that direction.
Yeah, the other direction, that Germans who were brought up Christian and have converted to Judaism. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But let me start off. We already have some questions, but let me start off with two of mine. I was also fascinated. I had never heard of this concept of a dry baptism. But it fits with my picture as a non-historian of the period, which is that, you know, people converted out of a mix of motives. They may have been sick of Orthodox Judaism, but it was primarily a sort of Paris is worth a mass thing. Do we have any examples of genuinely religious conversions? That is, somebody who said, I have seen the light and Jesus is my Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
We do have some.
We do have some, but most of them, I believe, end up in the conversion societies. So beginning in the 17th century, mainly in Halle, there's a very active conversion society. We also have a mission in London. We also have a very important conversion society actually in Jerusalem. And in those spaces, yes, we see Jews who became pastors and who took it all very seriously. And one of the things they do that's fascinating is they actually learn Yiddish and they appear in synagogues. which seems to me today to be a horribly aggressive thing, a convert coming into a service and, then going out afterwards and haranguing people about why they should change their religion. Amazing that, I know this sounds very modern, that a state would tolerate that, but of course the state is not involved. So yes, we do have sincere conversions, but in this world that I'm in, the most sincere, this world of the salons, I would say that Dorothea Mendelssohn Weitschlegel comes the closest, because we do have her in her writings. She said, I was in a church, I was in Rome. Rome is a very important place for them, and I suddenly saw, and this is what's amazing, she says, I suddenly saw Jesus, and next to him was my father. That Moses Mendelssohn is giving her permission to do this, which is a very useful fantasy for her.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a question which is slightly unfair, because I know that historians, focus on very particular slices of space and time, but I myself have been thinking quite a lot about 19th century English anti-Semitism, just for a change of pace.
Yeah, please.
And I'm working on George Eliot at the moment. So, and then reading around other authors, and there were, it's quite surprising how many English authors in the 19th century focused on Jews.
Oh, it's considered to be a philo-Semitic country in the 19th century.
By whom?
By Zionists who like that idea. Never mind, go ahead.
Oh boy. I mean, there is Ivanhoe with the beautiful Jew, who, however, emigrates because it's impossible to live as a Jew in England. Now that's set back in the Middle Ages and all that, but that's as far as I know, until Daniel Deronda, that's the only time when a Jewish character in England is valorized. It's bad. It strikes me as really bad. Just because we're in Germany and everyone, focuses on German anti-Semitism, but I see a lot of tropes in the English situation, which is a bit later and in another country, of the kind that you were talking about, and in particular, first of all, well, maybe most importantly, the idea of Volk is extremely strong. And the idea that even if they convert, Jews can't possibly, because you have the word anti-racism hadn't been invented. In fact, the word anti-Semitism hadn't even been invented. So, but you have a very strong notion of nationality. And Jewish is a nationality in England that you can't get out of. So I just wonder if you've, thought about sort of done work on the larger European comparisons or connections, and attitudes towards Jews in this complicated, Disraeli became prime minister, but nobody, he wasn't, and he converted when he was 12. But he was always considered to be not our class, dear, as the English say, and again, some people made fortunes, but they were invited into society, but they were always looked on as being, at best, vulgar.
Right.
And even simply vulgar for, they wave their hands, they talk like you and me, right? rather than talking like Brits. So I just wonder if you.
That's a deep question. So I guess one way to look at it is that the Berlin case of the salons is exceptional, not unique, but close to unique, because they're granted such immediate access into higher society. And intermarriage has to be at the center of this. That's the only way that you can really play this role of exiting the token outsider to become some kind of an insider. And I think if you look deeper, both in German society and in French and British society, also in Russian, it takes 2 or 3 generations to wash the stain away. So you're absolutely right that they can't be members of the folk. They can never be members of the folk. But if the percentage of Jewishness is decreasing and you manage to marry them off into established society, then it can become the family secret. Now, that doesn't do anything to help the Jewish cause. It only helps your particular family cause.
Right.
So in that regard, I think Disraeli is a fascinating example. And a friend of mine, Todd Endelman, wrote an article once called "Why Is There No Austrian or German Disraeli?" in which he goes exactly into the question you're talking about, which does Disraeli's success show that you could be a proud Jew? Because in many ways he is proud. He's always saying, "Oh, my ancestors were writing books when your ancestors were living in sand heaps." And he's not exactly a modest person about his Jewish heritage, and writes novels about Jews and goes to Palestine. So Disraeli manages to be both a political success and an outspoken Jew who's also converted. I don't think there's much space for very many Disraelis. And I think you could do an interesting contrast would actually be Dreyfus, because Dreyfus goes very far in the French army, and then he's knocked down as the supposed spy, when of course the real spy is a French nobleman. It's a tricky question. One way to look at it is you need to collapse time to answer the question. So you can't answer the question in 1820. You have to answer the question over the long period. And a lot of it has to do with numbers. The German Jews have lots and lots of Jews coming in, sort of yapping at the borders and speaking Yiddish, which is a language that could easily lead to German. It's not quite the case. The percentage of Jews in London and Paris is way, way smaller, which in a way you could say makes it easier. Susan, your question is too hard.
I said at the beginning it wasn't fair because it was a huge comparative question that was also
Want to destroy
related, no, also related to my current obsession. So that's okay. But what is interesting, and your remark about 3 generations washes the stain away and becomes a family secret, that is kind of the Nuremberg laws. Right? 3 generations of Christians.
But yeah, and then the Nurembergs, you're gonna wipe out, you're gonna say the emperor's got no clothes on, and all of a sudden, all those quarter Jews and all those half Jews are going to be exposed.
Quarter was okay. Quarter you could stay.
Only after 1935. Between 33 and 45, you couldn't. But the basic point, though, that is so shocking, it's so shocking, is the penetration of the anti-Jewish legislation into these partial Jews. Because you could say that if there's some problem with Judaism, then believing Jews and full Jews are a problem. But the idea that the germ of this is lurking in half Jews.
Yeah, but I think, this has been, but I'll stop in a second and ask if there are other questions. I mean, this has been ever since emancipation, since the end of the 18th century. The question of whether Judaism is a religion or a folk is a question also for Jews. We just had a huge debate about this. But how about someone else asking a question for a change? Yes, sir.
I'm struck with what may also be an unfair question, which is
you can take off your mask for the purpose of asking the question so we can understand you.
Great. I'm struck by what may also be an unfair question, in that I'm struck by comparisons, historical patterns. What you're talking about in the 18 teens, I'm wondering, does it repeat in a different variant in the 20s?
In the 1920s?
Yes.
In what sense?
Well, when you were describing the way in which certain people convert or because of class interests, make arrangements in their hope that it may help other people that are other Jews, but they're not themselves, strikes me as a pattern in Jewish history, And when I think of German history and my own ancestors, I'm thinking of the 20s, and I'm wondering if you could speak about that.
You mean, are you saying that when they flee Jewishness, that they're being selfish
No,
and not
no.
national? That's not what you're saying.
No, and I'm asking, I don't think that they are. I think the opposite. And I'm just wondering if there would be a way in which you could see this as a pattern,
Oh,
or
wait,
maybe I'm off.
They're helping other Jews by basically reducing the number of Jews in their country? No.
No. They're making arrangements in which that are class interests, and then that they're wondering if that pattern, if that could then help others. But I'm not being clear. What you were talking about the conversion and about following their class interests in this period, 19 teens, to me, it suggests that's something that is not only in this period, but also is later.
Well, there's no question that it is, but I'm wondering what you mean by helping others.
Well, they're helping themselves.
They're helping themselves, they're helping their family, their children, their
Right.
wives.
And then they also define that as helping other Jews, but it may not appear as if they are, but they perceive themselves as Jewish.
But they're helping other Jews. I just don't quite know what you mean helping.
Okay, if they are helping to change laws and they're helping to be part of the German nation.
Oh. So in other words, I leave Judaism, I come into the German folk, the German state, and I can be influential in making the regulations around, oh, yes, okay, now I understand exactly what you mean. Okay, yeah, no. That's a very, very, very interesting point. And the question is, would they be crazy and self-deluded if they thought that? And I think that's a tricky one. God, you guys are giving me a run for my money here. I would say that's more likely in the 19th century than in the 1920s. Because one way to look at the relationship between civic improvement and conversion, the traditional way to look at it is these people are converting as a kind of ersatz civic emancipation. So there is not really civic emancipation, and the only way to get some freedom to have the job you want, marry the person you want, is to become a Christian. Okay, but it seems that that's not true, because as we see civic emancipation growing, and in Germany it's in the time of German unification, then you don't need conversion, or you shouldn't need conversion for civic emancipation. I think the deeper analysis is that both civic emancipation and conversion are seen as ways to escape the whole problem. Because even after civic emancipation, there's lots of lingering, they're not really legal restrictions, but they're preferential hires and club exclusions and all that sort of thing. And so I think if what you're saying is, if I get to join, this is a very American example, it won't ring true in Germany. If I join the country club, I'll get the country club to change the rules, and then all my unconverted relatives can come in too. I think anybody who said that or thought that was deluding themselves, because in fact, I think the reality, this is certainly seen from a Zionist perspective. And if you look at the example of Victor Klemperer, who's, when I started reading him, he was just amazing, because I felt like he was speaking for all these decades before him, is that they want to reject everything Jewish. And whatever they do is not going to be helping other Jews, because the only way to help Jews as a group is for Jews to band together, like in the CV, the Jewish self-help organization, where they hire lawyers to deal with anti-Semitic cases. They monitor situations in the schools, and they do it in the name of Judaism. And I think that's actually a bridge to the Zionist perspective. And Hannah Arendt has a very famous quote about that, that directly addresses what you're saying. When you're attacked as a Jew, you have to defend yourself as a Jew. So I wish that was true. It would make me feel a little better about all those converts. Thank you.
Martin Schad.
This is not much of a question, rather a comment on what was just being discussed. I think the 20s are the wrong decade to look at. The 10s, there you have an intense movement amongst the youth movement in particular, where people do try to outbid each other of being part of the folk, and Jewish organizations, youth organizations, just as much as others. The bourgeois youth movement did the same. Walter Benjamin als Wandervogel. So I do think it didn't necessarily end in conversion, but the impetus was the same.
Yeah, although those, I was planning a book, I'm still planning a book on comparative German and Jewish nationalism, and the Wandervogel of the teens are of particular interest for all sorts of reasons. It's a totally fascinating phenomenon. But my understanding was that some of the Wandervogel organizations were proto-Zionist and some were what I would call hyper-assimilationist, and that you could sort of choose. And an interesting contrast here, since you mentioned Benjamin, would be Buber. Because if I'm not mistaken, Buber and Benjamin are roughly the same generation. Of course, Buber's raised in Eastern Europe in this very strong Jewish world. But why it is that someone like Benjamin, and there's that famous contest, is he going to go to Jerusalem? Is it going to be Gershom Scholem or Adorno? Who's going to win his soul? Is he really a Marxist? Could he possibly become a Zionist? You know, it's like a big stage example of this phenomenon. But I think it's really remarkable how unpopular Zionism was in among the really, really powerful intellects of the period between the two wars. And I'm not sure if you could categorize why some drift to Zionism and some militantly resisted, whether it's because of whether class plays a role or whether there really is something that's called patriotism. There really are people who feel powerful German patriots, and there are other people who feel powerfully Jewish patriots. And for a long time, that can exist in a sort of protean form without having to make a political decision. And that's what's so gut-wrenching about the Nazi period. You know, are you going to go? I was just reading about the leader of Youth Aliyah. She crosses the border illegally to Yugoslavia in 1940, and she's in Palestine by 41. You know, and then there's other people who wouldn't, like Benjamin, wouldn't dream of doing that unless he's absolutely pushed.
But I think what you're both pointing to is the phenomena that we know from, and you might know the actual numbers of people who did not immigrate until the very last minute, and often I didn't even think about it too late because, you know, they had an Iron Cross or their father had an Iron Cross. I mean, there was a very large number of Jews who volunteered in the First World War and felt themselves to be absolutely committed.
How about the quarter Jews who serve in World War II? They serve in the Wehrmacht.
That's true, there are a few of those too.
Right? Yeah, I think we can't use hindsight. We can't expect them to have foresight. So the dilemma for me, that's why I wrote these two books, is how to honor their desire to I wouldn't say they're joining the folk. I would say in their view, they're joining the civilization. That's a very common contrast between a civilization and a folk. So I think it's too easy to just say, well, don't you really realize you're never going to make that? Don't you realize that they really hate you and it's all a false dream? I can't do that. It's too dishonoring to them. I feel like the whole phenomenon of the Nazi period, at least inside of Germany, and certainly not for Eastern Europe, only makes sense if you see the tragedy as a tragedy of what these people over the generations are losing. They're I won't say it's innocent. I won't say it may be naive, but their successful assimilation has been wiped out, at least when I started writing, was wiped out of the history. It was like they were all deluded if you read Fritz Stern, if you read Peter Gay, no, not Gay so much, but Fritz Stern for sure. It was George Mossey for sure. And what's his name? Hitler's Willing Executioners. The whole book is saturated with this idea. How could they not know they were entering into an evil compact and it was all going to end badly? It's ridiculous. So, but in between saying that that's ridiculous and valorizing them as some, I don't know, totally sincere assimilationists. I'm trying to strike something in the middle there.
Yeah. Well, that's what was so interesting and nuanced about your book. Martin, did you?
If I may, I don't want to, if there are other questions, that's fine, but.
I have a couple of questions in the chat, but do you want to follow up? Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, well, it's a slight change of topic. Let's talk money for a second. You mentioned at the very outset that you would consider class, which you did, but let's just talk money, straight money. People like Amalia Beer, the lady who is in that wonderful painting, was she in the end successful?
In what sense? Successful in what?
In the Reform Judaism leading to emancipation.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say, could she manage being a Reform Jew at home and a cultured folk on the outside? She was successful for a time. In 1823, the Prussian government moves to repress Reform Judaism. And the reason that they do that is because they want the conversion numbers to rise. They want the binary. They don't want the middle way. If you want a hero from the post-1823 period, it's Leopold Zunz, because he and Edward Ganz are in the, as Heine is in the Wissenschaft des Judentums of 1819, and then Heine departs and Ganz departs, and Ganz becomes a professor, and Heine becomes a poet, right? He goes to Paris, that's another solution. And Zunz is left holding the bag. And what that meant was a big sacrifice. It meant that you only socialized with other Jews. It meant that you had a pretty obscure position teaching in a Jewish teachers' college. So the class situation was, if you were really quite poor, quite modest like Zunz, you couldn't go the route of Amalia Beer anyway. And you probably couldn't go to the route of Ganz either, because Ganz's whole education, his relationship with Hegel, it's cushioned by the wealth of the family. And so the thing I'm interested in is those who are wealthy like Amalia Beer and seem committed to the reform of Judaism, because that was the way to keep the conversion rates down. And that was the way to show that was the way to show them the Mendelssohnian promise, a Jew at home and a citizen on the street. The people that I'm talking about, want to become the Christian in the home and on the street, or to validate that. But it doesn't, Amalia Beer does not succeed in keeping her children Jewish. They all marry Christians. So it seemed as if you could only save it off so far. You could look to the Rothschilds as a very different model, because they have the money, they have the wine, they have the international connections, they have the financial success, and they don't. Yes. But they don't, they're very draconian with the women. They don't allow their women, their daughters, to participate in the business. And they gain a sort of outsider chicness, you could say, especially over the generations, while still being Jewish. Now, but they're not, what's also interesting about the Rothschilds is they're not involved in the Haskalah. The Judaism that they retain is really an Orthodox Judaism. So they have money, they have Orthodox Judaism. And so there is a way of thinking that they're girding, they're pushing themselves up to a certain point, and over the generations, they could become chic. But the chicness is the ultimate coinage of the chicness is going to be intermarriage. But it is a very different model, and it's a very German Jewish model at the same time. I guess I could have had Rahel Varnhagen, Rahel Levin marrying a Rothschild.
Who do you got said?
Yeah, sorry. Talking of conversion, we always talk about it like becoming Christian, but was there any discussion about what kind of Christian? I mean, obviously in Berlin and around here, it's more likely to become a Protestant because that is a majority. But on the other hand, people like Clement Sprentano were Catholics, so you could be, there is another model for, at least we could, or Jews could think about whether it would be more like or more interesting to become Protestants or Catholics. So on the other thing is, I don't know, but as far as I can remember, you did not mention or the concept of enlightenment in your talk, which would be very obvious for this time and for these people. Like, does that matter? Don't you think that I mean, if it's not so important to be what kind of religion you have, so it might be an easier way to convert anyway.
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so you got at some of the weak points in the talk here. You know, when you write a talk like this, you're always thinking, I better include this. Oh, no, I don't have time. And then someone tells you that you should have. The Catholic thing is extremely interesting because while obviously in Prussia, Lutheranism would be the religion to convert to, even in Vienna, the converts are mostly to Protestantism. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about why that was. And the best answer is that they wanted to be modern. So if you're leaving Judaism, and Judaism is provincial and rule-oriented and, you know, primitive, you want to choose a religion that is modern. So you wouldn't choose Catholicism because Catholicism would be too much like Judaism. There's also the question of, are there Catholic elites that are willing to accept you? I mean, you could say what you want about Fichte and Arendt and Schleiermacher, but to some degree, they're in the force field of the Jewish salons. They may not totally respect these women and they might write hateful things, but they're certainly aware of what's going on. So I think Protestantism makes sense for Prussia. Why it doesn't make so much sense for other places is a really interesting question. And a key figure here is actually Edith Stein. She's way after what we're talking about, but Edith Stein becomes a Catholic. Don't know how much her study with Husserl or her intellectual background leads her in that direction. But when she and her sister are deported from their convent, I can't remember exactly where the convent is, they're, you know, taken away by the Gestapo. And Edith turns to her sister and she says, Rosa, we're going for our people. What did she mean? Was it like a martyrdom? You know, we're going for them, or we're going as part of them. In other words, I am still Jewish. She did go to Yom Kippur services with her mother regularly after she became a nun, but that's a diversion. Enlightenment and Romanticism, the reason I don't mention them is because I wrote this book convinced that the intellectual history of this topic was pretentious, abstract, not useful. I wrote it as a kind of a militant social historian, that I was going to deal with relationships and money and institutions and not with so-called ideas. Because after all, was ist Aufklärung? There's no way to be a cosmopolitan intellectual in 1800. You can't do that. someone like Rosa Luxemburg, or, 100 years later, that was their dominant ideology, was actually Enlightenment. We're beyond all this. We don't have to deal with religion. Of course, they were tragically wrong because they were hated as Jews. But I would say in 1800, the ism of Enlightenment, like what books are on your shelf? Do you read Kant? Do you read John Locke? I just don't see that as being relevant to anybody's decision-making. And that's not what they were discussing in the salons either, because by the time of the salons in the 1890s, you'd already moved into the Romantic period. And if anything, the Romantics are much more attentive to feelings and to states of being than they are to abstract rejections of traditional religion. I think that the person to talk about that with would be Marcus Hertz, who wrote these essays and was a student of Kant, and would have loved that question. But I just don't think I'm with him on that.
Franziska Bobski.
Just a short addition to what Rüdiger Zill just said. I'm not sure you can really think German Romanticism without Enlightenment, because those thinkers were really, really important for most, even the seemingly irrationalist thinkers in Romanticism. And I'm not sure you can just leave that out.
Wait, I missed a word
for that, and let's point out that Kant's favorite philosopher was Rousseau. So, I don't think you can divide us.
Wait, I missed the first sentence.
I want to support what Rüdiger Zill just said, because German Romanticism is not thinkable without Enlightenment.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's Aufhebung of Enlightenment. It's
not really. It's actually a continuity there that's often overlooked. And so it's not that the Romantic thinkers, even people like Novalis thought about combining all religions, and he took a nationalist drift also. I don't want to hide that, but it's not, Enlightenment ideas were very important to them. And that's where I think you cannot say we have a Romantic age, because there's no
I understand.
clear...
But let's grant you that. What does it have to do then with this fundamental decision as, are you going to stay Jewish? What does Enlightenment or Romanticism have to say that would stave off the let's take the hypothesis that not converting would have been better for the Jews. Not converting might have been better for their inner psyches. And why was conversion so prevalent? And so if you ask that question and then you say, oh, what about these two isms, Enlightenment and Romanticism? What was in the content of Enlightenment and Romanticism that really spoke to this social dilemma of how to be a person in the world of standing and still be Jewish? Does Enlightenment and Romanticism, it could be my ignorance, but do those world belief systems, you might say, or Weltanschauungs, how do they influence that kind of decision about a religion? I can't imagine. There's a lot of Jews who thought of themselves as enlightened, or they might have thought of themselves as romantic, but was there anything in let's call it an ideology, that was welcoming them in as Jews?
You have, of course, in Romanticism, very strong reference to Jewish philosophers. So that might have called them in.
Which, do you mean like to Kabbalah or something like that?
Spinoza is very important even for classicism. So you can think that without Spinoza.
Yeah, but Spinoza's polytheism is very attractive. No, pantheism, sorry. It's very, very attractive. But he was certainly no shining hero of the Jewish people, and he's not treated very, very well. In fact, Da Costa is treated much, much worse. And apparently Moses Mendelssohn lived in fear of being a Spinoza. What did that mean? That mean he would no longer have an influence on the Jewish people. So he would keep the religious laws while he's writing these pieces that are nothing relate. I mean, well, they're very important German philosophy, but he doesn't want to be excluded the way Spinoza was excluded. So Spinoza influences a lot of, people like Heine and Rahel. They all read Spinoza. They're inspired by Spinoza, but he doesn't give them a practical option, I don't think. Yeah, it is a question.
It's like being called a communist or BDS or any of those things that puts you beyond the pale. In the 18th and 19th century, everybody is reading Spinoza, but they're not admitting it, and reject at least the people that I know from the 18th century, mostly Francisco. I'm not sure.
I mean, one way to think about it.
I think it's an exception. And a very famous
but
one.
Goethe's, but the Prometheus poem, I mean, that started the Pantheismus-Streit, where, Goethe was an exception to everything, I guess. But that poem caused, an enormous scandal. You probably know this better than I do. We have nearly used up our time. Before I turn to the questions from the chat, is there anybody in the room? Okay, so you have several questions and remarks from Mario Kessler, a historian. He says, an appreciation. I first came across Rahel Varnhagen in the DDR through the biography of Herbert Scuria. I did not know then that Scuria had been a fanatical Nazi in his first life, who was a high official denounced German refugees in Turkey to the Nazi authorities, including Ernst Reuter and Gerhard Kessler. This is also part of the dark story of the subject. Interesting. All the more important to me was your book on Jewish salons. It is, in my opinion, on a par with the standard works of Hannah Arendt and Hilde Spiel, a great contribution to Jewish and women's emancipation. So.
Tell my Jean.
Okay. So now, after the appreciation, a few questions. You mentioned the Tischgesellschaft as a reactionary alternative to the salons. May I recall the case of Friedrich Buchholz, who was, as far as I know, not permitted to the Tischgesellschaft. He opposed the nationalism of Arndt, Jahn, and the like, but opposed also the emancipation of the Jews. How typical was such a contradictory attitude among Berlin's early liberals?
Wow. Yeah, I remember Buchholz. I don't think it's very common at all. There is a Jewish writer his name is Saul Asher. Saul Asher, have really a hard time finding information about him. Of course, he's not Jewish, so he is Jewish, so he couldn't have been in the Tischgesellschaft, but he is a rabid opponent of Grottenauer, who wrote a book in 1803 called Wieder die Juden, which you could see as a kind of Tischgesellschaft predecessor. No, I think that's very uncommon. And in fact, one of the topics that I aim to research is whether German nationalism, this is a sidebar to the question because I don't have a good answer, was unusually hostile to Jews, or whether it was mainly because there is a dialectic between the success of the salons and the nationalism, in which there's actually a kind of a conversation going on between them, and that the anti-Semitism of the German nationalists at this time period it's not as it were coming out of a book. It's because they don't like how much influence these women are having in society, in which case it could be that you're having also a conservative liberal debate that's going on, because Arnheim sees the Tischgesellschaft as an embryonic parliament, which just made an incredible impression upon me when I read that, because it's a very different interpretation than saying it's a counter salon. To say that, we need to start working towards, what France has as a national assembly, and we're going to do it in this restaurant with 46 people is a good idea. So I think there's many, many layers there, but I have to do more about bookholes. Well, thank that person.
Okay, I think he's hearing you, Mario. Two more questions.
Yes.
From him. A remarkable number of Jewish women in these circles married Christian men. Do you know of any Christian woman who married a Jewish man and possibly converted to Judaism? I would doubt it.
Yeah, there's almost none. I think there might be one case, but I can't remember what it is. Maybe it's because there is a legislation in Prussia, I believe, that makes it illegal to convert to Judaism at a certain point. It's obviously withdrawn later because we do see cases in the 20th century. But I explain that as I think a somewhat typical trend in a cross-religious, cross-ethnic, cross-race intermarriage in which the woman is of the lower status, so that when she comes into the relationship, her husband can dominate her on two dimensions, gender and ethnicity. And the parents, the grandparents, don't have to worry that their grandchildren are going to be marked by the male line, and the female line has a greater chance to disappear. So the question then really has to do with what are the conversations among the Christian men and their families about whether this is going to be permitted or not. And once you form the new couple, you have two ways you can be estranged from her Jewish family and from his Christian family. Really, that's a very important statistical study.
My last question, I promise, says Mario Kessler. Could you please say a few more words about the reasons why the Salons basically stopped a few years before the partial emancipation of 1812? Was it because of rising nationalism? Were there other reasons, such as new forms of communication? Communication in the Salons were exclusively oral, but in these years, the role of pamphlets and newspapers increased.
Okay, I've given a lot of thought to this because some important research came out in the years since I published the book that shows the continuity of salons and that they did go on, and that this idea that it all stops abruptly. So all salons stop abruptly in 2006 when Prussia is conquered and social life falls apart for quite some time. However, by about 1811, when you see the burgeoning national movement and the occupation rules go down a bit, we do have noble salons that have been going on. Louise von Voss, there's another one too. Those noble salons, Elizabeth von Stegemann, are, as it were, sopping up the need for the salon. But as the questioner suggests, Professor Kessler, there's so many other ways to communicate that are emerging. The newspaper, the bookstore, the nationalist movement itself. So you might have a functional argument that the decline of the salons was not because of anti-Semitism of the Jewish salons, but salons in general were a backward-looking social institution that only exists insofar as these other modes of communication and social mixing are not there. But if you notice from a wonderful exhibition at the Jewish Museum that produced a book on salons, you know, we see important salons all through the 19th century and the 20th century. And now that I'm working in Russian history, I'm finding them everywhere. So the tradition itself definitely continues and takes some really interesting side turns. Like I have a woman from the Zionist Congress, and she's married to a Columbia professor, Emma Gottheil. She has salons on Shabbat. So she's so proud of her Judaism, but she still wants to be a salonier that she combines the two of them. So it is it's quite a protean institution that can take different shapes in different times.
Thank you very much for wonderful talk. And as you can see by the fact that it is quite late, produced an awful lot of interest. Thank those of you who are still in the cyber world listening. Thank all of you who came out here, and please join me in thanking Deborah. Just have to add a quick logistical note. This is our last event for 2021. We wish you all a happy and safe and peaceful respite. At the end of the year, we reconvene with a day-long conference on animal ethics. Calendar, what's the date? Sorry.
The 12th of January.
The 12th of January, we will have a day-long conference on the ethics of human beings dealing with animals. We will have, I believe, representatives from 5 different religious traditions, as well as secular thinkers and philosophers on the question of our duties in relationship to animals and everything connected with that. So I hope you will join us on January 12th.